Here's your podcast script. The New York Times ran an opinion piece this week with a pointed headline: Trump's science cuts betray America's past since Lewis and Clark. And the argument it makes is worth sitting with for a few minutes. Last year, the Trump administration paused or canceled 7,840 research grants, and those were just the ones funded by the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health. There have been proposed cuts to the Forest Service, to NASA, and the list keeps growing. The author, Craig Fairman, who wrote A History of Lewis and Clark, says these cuts don't just threaten America's future. They contradict something fundamental about how this country was built. So let's go back to 1804. Thomas Jefferson wanted to send Meriwether Lewis and William Clark west up the Missouri River, across the Rockies, to the Pacific. But first, he had to convince Congress to pay for it. He asked for $2,500. He knew that was low. When the expedition returned in 1806, the War Department put the cost at $38,000. When you factor in everything, including the native diplomats Lewis and Clark brought to Washington on the government's tab, the total climbed to $100,000 or more. The federal budget at the time ran about $10 million a year. In proportional terms, that's roughly what all of NASA costs today. And most of that money went to science. Jefferson didn't just want a trade route. He directed Lewis to collect data across what would fill an entire modern university: botany, zoology, geology, climatology, anthropology, linguistics. Lewis pressed flowers, rendered bird calls phonetically, shot grizzly bears and sliced them open to measure their hearts. He once pounded a mineral sample into powder and inhaled the toxic fumes trying to identify it. Clark drew maps with such precision that the expedition's 278 astronomical observations are still considered remarkably accurate. Sacagawea gathered botanical specimens. York, a black man enslaved by Clark, collected invertebrates. Everyone contributed. Now, Fairman is honest about the darker side of all this. The expedition's scientific agenda was also an imperial one. Jefferson knew the data would reach experts around the world and strengthen American claims to native land. Clark, scouting a path through the Rockies on the way home, looked at a road the native peoples had long used and noted that if someone cut down a few trees, it would make an excellent wagon road. The captains were thinking about expansion without dwelling much on the native suffering that would follow. But here's where Fairman's argument gets interesting and directly relevant to what's happening right now. The research Lewis and Clark produced had consequences nobody predicted. One fur trader followed Lewis's advice, opened a post near the Pacific coast, and hired an employee who ended up identifying the mountain pass that became the Oregon Trail. Jefferson could not have drawn a straight line from the expedition to that outcome. Nobody could have. But the public investment created the conditions for it to happen. That's the core of Fairman's case. Research timelines are long. Breakthroughs are impossible to anticipate in advance. The path from federal funding to the internet, or to mRNA vaccines, was just as circuitous as the path from Lewis and Clark to the Oregon Trail. You fund possibility. You don't always know what you're funding until decades later. There's a quiet, human note at the end of the piece. Lewis struggled with depression and died by suicide in 1809, before he could publish his scientific work. Jefferson wrote a remembrance. He said Lewis's hope for Americans was simply to extend for them the boundaries of science. Jefferson later revised that line. He crossed out they and wrote their sons, because he understood that ambitious projects don't always pay off on the timeline of the people who start them. Sometimes you plant something for the next generation to harvest. That's the piece. Whether you think today's cuts are justified or not, the historical argument Fairman is making is a serious one. America has funded science as a public good since its earliest days, and the returns, when they've come, have rarely looked like anyone expected. I'm glad you took a few minutes to think about it with me. Approximate read time, 4 minutes.